The earth had become a reflection of the human heart, dark and twisted beyond recognition. What was once a realm of harmony, created by God's own hands, had turned into a distorted reflection of itself. Mankind, who had been formed in the image of the divine, had long since forsaken that image. Their hearts, once pure and filled with the breath of God, had been corrupted by sin. Their thoughts, once lofty and righteous, now turned with ruthless and selfish desires. The world was no longer a paradise, but a realm steeped in evil, violence, and despair. The wickedness of man spread like a poison through the land. From the high mountains to the deepest valleys, sin seemed to infect everything. The air was thick with deceit, the land soaked in betrayal, and the seas roiled with greed. Mankind's cruelty knew no bounds, their hearts hardened, deaf to the cries of the oppressed, blind to the suffering they caused. As the days wore on, the cries of the weak and the innocent reached the heavens, their lamentations echoing through the cosmos. The harmony that once defined creation had been shattered, and the world had become a battlefield of sin. God, in His omnipotence, saw this unfolding tragedy. His heart broke at the sight. This was not the creation He had intended, nor was this the world He had breathed life into. His anger was not born of wrath, but of sorrow. For how could it be that the creatures He had lovingly shaped, the beings He had infused with His own breath, had turned so far from His will? How could they, who had been entrusted with the stewardship of the earth, let it fall into chaos? How had they become so deaf to His voice, so blind to His love? The treachery they had wrought cut deep into the very soul of creation. But though His heart was filled with grief, God was not without a plan. Justice demanded action, and in His wisdom, He knew that restoration could only come through destruction. In His great mercy, He decided that the world, as it was, must be washed clean. The stain of sin that had taken root in every corner of the earth could not be allowed to spread any further. It was time for a cleansing, for a new beginning. And yet, even in His judgment, God's mercy would not be absent. The decision was made. The heavens trembled with anticipation as the Creator's will was set into motion. God spoke, His voice like thunder, reverberating through the cosmos, shaking the very foundations of the earth. His words were filled with sorrow, not vengeance, for His justice was tempered with grief. "I will wipe from the face of the earth the creatures I have made," He declared, His tone heavy with the weight of the task ahead. "From man to beast, from creeping thing to bird of the sky, for I regret that I have made them." The words struck like a hammer on an anvil, and the earth, in its wretchedness, seemed to hold its breath. But then, in the midst of His sorrow, God's voice softened. It was as if the Lord had momentarily turned His gaze from the darkness of mankind and focused on a single ray of light in the vast shadow. "But Noah," He called, His voice shifting, filled with recognition. "Noah is righteous, and I will spare him." Noah, the only man who still walked in alignment with the heart of God, was chosen. In the midst of all the corruption, Noah had remained pure. He had not bent to the ways of the world, nor had he allowed the sin that surrounded him to seep into his own soul. Though he was a man living in the darkness of an age where the light of righteousness was almost extinguished, he remained steadfast. His life had been one of quiet devotion, an unspoken faith that resonated deeply within him. To God, Noah represented the last glimmer of the good, and the holy that had once inhabited the world. Noah's righteousness was not born of perfection, but of a constant turning toward God, even in the face of relentless evil. His heart, though imperfect, sought after the Lord. While the world around him had fallen into chaos and despair, Noah lived in harmony with God's will. He had not turned to violence as others had, nor had he given in to greed or hatred. Instead, he had kept his heart pure, a stark contrast to the depravity of those who surrounded him. His devotion was a testament to God's faithfulness, a beacon of light amidst the overwhelming darkness. It was for this reason that God chose Noah to carry out His plan of salvation. Through Noah's obedience, the seeds of a new beginning would be sown, the flood would cleanse the earth, and Noah's family, along with a remnant of every living creature, would be preserved. God's mercy, though it required destruction, would ensure the survival of life. And so, God gave Noah a command unlike any he had ever received. He was to build an ark, a vessel of salvation. This ark, crafted to specific and divine specifications, would be the refuge from the coming flood. It would be large enough to hold Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, along with a pair of every kind of animal, from the majestic to the meek, from the mighty predators to the timid prey. Every living thing would be preserved, for God's creation was not meant to be destroyed, only renewed. Noah listened, his heart heavy with the weight of the task ahead. There was no hesitation in his heart, he would obey. In his obedience lay his trust in God's plan. Noah, though he did not know the full scope of what was to come, knew one thing: he had been chosen, and he would fulfill God's will, no matter the cost. Thus began Noah's labor, a labor of faith, of hope, and of obedience to a God whose ways were beyond understanding but whose promises were sure. And so, while the world raged in its wickedness, Noah set to work, driven by the command of God and the promise of salvation. Noah received God's command in the stillness of his home, his heart heavy with the weight of the task that lay before him. God spoke again, giving Noah the instructions with great precision, the dimensions of the ark, the materials to use, and the design that would ensure its survival in the coming flood. It was to be a vessel of salvation, a symbol of God's mercy in the face of his wrath. Noah's mind raced. The task ahead was immense. How could he, one man, ever complete such a monumental project? How could he build something that would withstand the wrath of the very waters that would engulf the earth? Yet, despite his doubts, there was no room for question. His faith in God was unwavering, and the command was clear. He would do as God instructed, even though the world around him mocked and scorned him. Noah's family, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, joined him in the laborious work of construction. Day after day, they toiled under the harsh sun, hauling timber, measuring, cutting, and shaping. The ark slowly took form, an immense structure that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. It was no simple task, and the work was exhausting. But Noah's faith in God, and in his promise of salvation, gave him strength. As Noah built, he did more than simply work with his hands. He spoke of the coming flood, of the judgment that would fall upon the earth. He warned the people, urging them to repent, to turn away from their wickedness. "Repent, for the end is near," he cried out to all who would listen. "Turn back to the Lord that you may live." But no one listened. The people mocked him, laughed at him, and called him a fool. They continued in their evil ways, dismissing Noah's words as the ramblings of an eccentric man. How could they possibly believe such a thing? Their world had never seen such a disaster. The waters would never rise, as Noah said. They continued to live in their sin, reveling in their indulgence, blind to the impending doom. Year after year, the ark grew larger, and Noah's warnings grew more desperate. Yet, the world remained indifferent. The more Noah built, the more the world mocked. The laughter of the wicked filled the air, like a chorus of ignorance that drowned out the whispers of truth. But Noah, undeterred, continued his work, trusting in the God who had called him. Each hammer strike was an act of faith, each timber laid another testament to his obedience. As the ark neared completion, the world outside remained unchanged. The people laughed harder, the corruption deeper. But Noah knew that time was running out. God had spoken, and the flood was coming. The ark would be the only refuge. It would be a vessel of mercy, holding Noah, his family, and the creatures that God had created, a remnant to begin anew after the waters had cleansed the earth. And so, the days passed, the years dragged on, but Noah remained steadfast, obedient to God's command. He knew that his task was not just to build an ark, it was to preserve life, to keep the promise of creation alive in a world that had turned its back on its creator. The ark stood upon the earth, an immense and looming structure, towering above the landscape like a monument to the obedience of one man. Years of labor had gone into its construction, each plank, each nail driven in with meticulous care, a testament to Noah's unwavering faith in the command of God. It had been a long and arduous journey, one filled with mocking laughter, doubt, and the isolation of a man who stood alone in his righteousness against a world drowning in its sin. But now, the work was done. The great ark, a vessel of salvation in the coming storm, stood ready. Noah looked upon the ark, the vastness of it now almost overwhelming. His heart was heavy, filled with both grief for the world he had known and hope for the new beginning that God had promised. Around him, his family gathered, the ones who had stood by him, his wife, his sons, and their wives. Together, they had endured the ridicule, the stares, and the isolation, united by a single truth: they had been called to something greater than themselves. They had been chosen for this purpose, this sacred task. But it wasn't just his family who would enter the ark. The time had come for the animals. 2 by 2, from the great beasts of the field to the creeping things of the earth, they came. Lions, tigers, and bears, elephants, deer, and wolves, even the smallest creatures, bugs, birds, and creeping things, arrived as if drawn by some invisible force, as though the very earth itself recognized the call. The air was thick with the sound of their movement, the shuffle of hooves and paws, the flapping of wings, the hissing of reptiles. They came in an orderly procession, as if they too understood the magnitude of the moment. Noah, with a heart full of awe, helped guide the creatures into the ark. There was no fear in their eyes, only an unspoken understanding. And as they moved inside, Noah felt a deep sense of reverence. God had given him this responsibility, this duty to preserve life when the rest of the world was beyond saving. It was a heavy burden, yet it was also a profound honor. Once the animals were safely aboard, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives entered the ark. The door, which had remained open throughout the building process, now stood ready to be closed. A silence fell over the scene as Noah and his family took their places within the ark. There was no need for words. Each person knew their role, knew the gravity of the moment. Noah looked up to the heavens, and in that moment he knew that the Lord's judgment was upon the earth. The time for waiting was over. Then it happened. In the stillness, a heavy, unnatural silence descended upon the land. And from the sky, as if the heavens themselves had opened their mouths to weep, the rain began to fall. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but then it intensified, rapidly becoming a torrential downpour. The rain came in sheets, as though the very waters of the deep had broken loose and began to pour down in relentless fury. Noah stood at the ark's door, his hand on the wooden frame, feeling the first drops of rain on his skin. A shudder ran through him, not from fear, but from the weight of the reality unfolding. He knew that once the door was closed, the earth would never be the same again. The flood, a cleansing tide to rid the earth of its corruption, had begun. And there was no turning back. With a final, sorrowful glance at the world outside, Noah stepped into the ark and called for the door to be sealed. As the massive door groaned shut, a finality settled over the land. The rains fell harder now, in torrents, as if the heavens themselves wept in judgment. And then, with a great sigh, the door clicked into place, sealing them inside. God had commanded the flood, and now, God himself sealed the ark. It was his protection, his promise of safety for those who had obeyed his command. No more could the wickedness of the world penetrate the ark's sturdy walls. No more could the world's corruption reach them. Inside, there was only God's mercy, and his judgment had begun to unfold. The floodwaters rose. The ground, once solid and firm beneath their feet, began to churn. The rains fell for 40 days and 40 nights, a deluge that wiped away everything in its path. Mountains that had once soared proudly now disappeared beneath the rising waters. Rivers swelled and overflowed, their banks no longer able to contain the torrent. Cities and villages, homes and fields, all vanished beneath the endless waves. The earth itself seemed to tremble and groan as it was consumed by the flood. Inside the ark, Noah and his family could hear the roaring of the storm outside, the relentless pounding of the rain against the ark's hull. But they were safe. They were protected. As the storm raged on, the ark floated upon the waters, carried by the mighty current, bobbing like a small island amidst the chaos. The world outside was unrecognizable now, swallowed whole by the flood. The cries of the wicked, the laughter of those who had mocked Noah, all were silenced. The earth had been cleansed, and nothing remained but water and the ark that carried the remnants of life. The floodwaters covered the earth for 40 days and nights, but within the ark, Noah and his family huddled together, trusting in God's promise. They did not know what the world would look like when the rain finally stopped, but they knew that they had obeyed, and in that obedience, they would survive. The flood had begun, but so too had the chance for renewal. The storm had raged for 40 days and 40 nights, the earth submerged beneath an unrelenting torrent of water. For what seemed like an eternity, Noah and his family had remained within the ark, their world reduced to the confines of its wooden walls. The sound of the rain had faded, leaving only the constant rise and fall of the waters. Yet even as the floodwaters surged, a glimmer of hope remained in the hearts of Noah and his family, the belief that God's promise would bring them through this trial, and that one day, the earth would be dry again. As the days passed, the rain eventually ceased, though the waters still covered the earth. The ark floated aimlessly upon the endless sea, carried by the remnants of the storm. There was no sign of land, only the vast expanse of water stretching in every direction. Still, Noah remained patient, knowing that God's timing was perfect. But as the days turned to weeks, his heart began to stir with the hope that the waters would soon recede. Noah's first instinct was to find some sign that the earth was returning to life. He knew that God had not brought them this far only to leave them in a world of desolation. With this in mind, Noah sent out the raven, a bird that would fly over the floodwaters and seek a sign of dry land. The raven took flight, soaring out into the dark sky, its wings cutting through the air as it circled above the floodwaters. But it did not return. For days the raven flew back and forth, perched on floating debris and the remnants of drowned forests, not finding any solid ground. Noah's heart sank as he watched the raven's persistence. But he did not give up hope. The raven, after all, was not a bird of peace, it was a scavenger, accustomed to finding food on the surface of the earth. So, Noah turned to a gentler creature for his next task, the dove. The dove, a symbol of peace, would be a messenger of gentler means. Noah released the dove into the open air, trusting that it would search for any sign of dry land where it could rest. The dove flew into the sky, its wings fluttering softly as it scanned the endless expanse of water below. It too flew far, searching for any hint of the land beneath, but when it returned to the ark, it brought with it no sign of hope, no branch of tree or sign of earth. The dove had found nothing, and it returned to the ark, seeking shelter once more. Yet Noah, though disheartened, was not discouraged. He waited another 7 days and sent out the dove again, this time hoping for a clearer sign. He watched as the dove disappeared into the horizon once more, and with bated breath, he waited for its return. This time, the dove returned, but this time it carried something in its beak. Noah's heart leapt as he saw the small olive branch clutched in the bird's delicate mouth. It was a sign. The dove's return with the olive branch was a signal that the waters had receded, that the earth was beginning to emerge from the flood's grasp. Life, it seemed, was returning to the world. Noah's family gathered around him, awe in their eyes as they saw the branch, the symbol of peace and renewal. The olive tree was a sign of restoration, of new beginnings. It was as if God Himself had sent this small, humble branch as a token of His promise fulfilled. The waters had receded. The flood was not the end, but the beginning of something new. With the olive branch, Noah knew that it was time to prepare for the next step. The ark had carried them through the storm, but now the time had come to leave it behind and step into the world that would be reborn. The earth would again bear fruit. It would again support life. And so, with the olive branch in hand, Noah's hope surged. The flood was receding, the world was healing, and the promise of God's covenant would soon unfold. The dove had brought the sign of new life, and the earth, though battered and scarred, was ready to begin anew. When Noah and his family stepped onto dry land, they were met with a world made new. The air was crisp, untainted, carrying the scent of fresh earth. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a cleansed and quiet landscape. The sun shone brightly, casting golden light upon the land that had once been submerged. Silence filled the air, as if creation itself paused in awe of what had taken place. The destruction had passed, and now, renewal had come. As Noah looked around, taking in the vast, open sky, God spoke to him with a message of great significance. "Never again will I destroy the earth with a flood," he declared. "This is my covenant with you and with every living creature that will come after you." It was a promise of mercy, a divine assurance that such devastation would never again sweep across the earth. To seal this eternal covenant, God placed a rainbow in the sky. Its brilliant colors stretched across the heavens, a magnificent arc of light and beauty. This rainbow would serve as a sign for all generations, a reminder of God's unwavering faithfulness and His mercy toward mankind. Whenever rain would fall upon the earth, the rainbow would appear as a symbol of hope, a reassurance that God's promise would never be forgotten. Noah and his family stood in reverence, watching the radiant display above them. The rainbow spoke of peace between God and His creation, of restoration and new beginnings. Though the flood had wiped away the past, the future now held the promise of life and renewal. God had not abandoned His creation but had instead given it a new chance to flourish. As the colors shimmered in the sky, Noah understood the depth of God's love and faithfulness. The rainbow was more than just a beautiful sight. It was a divine signature, a mark of an unbreakable covenant. Through storms and seasons, through generations to come, it would remind humanity of God's enduring mercy. Never again would the earth face such destruction, for God's word was true, His promise unshaken. The world had been given a new beginning, and in that moment, beneath the vast sky, Noah and his family embraced the hope that came with it.